Walter Lippmann was a New York intellectual and a towering figure who became one of the most influential journalists and political commentators of the 20th century. Walter Lippmann, writer, political philosopher, and public intellectual, was born in New York City on September 23, 1889. He came from a prosperous German Jewish family. He had a sharp intellect and an elegant writing style. Lippmann's early years were marked by privilege and precocity. He attended Harvard University, graduating in 1910 after only 3 years, a testament to his exceptional abilities. His education there shaped his understanding of politics, philosophy, and society, though his later career would test and refine those ideas through decades of engagement with the most pressing issues of his time. After graduating from Harvard, Lippmann briefly pursued graduate studies but quickly abandoned academia for the world of journalism and politics. He became involved with socialist politics and worked as an assistant to the muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens. It was during this time that Lippmann began developing his ideas about democracy, public opinion, and the role of intellectuals in shaping policy. In 1913, at the remarkably young age of 23, Lippmann published his first book, A Preface to Politics. The book was a sophisticated analysis of political psychology and the limitations of rational politics. It attracted attention from intellectuals and established Lippmann as a serious thinker despite his youth. Lippmann's early career showed extraordinary promise. His writing combined philosophical depth with practical political analysis in ways that few journalists could match. However, despite his intellectual gifts, the business of sustaining a career as an independent thinker proved challenging. Lippmann needed platforms and patrons to reach audiences and influence policy. In 1914, Lippmann helped found the New Republic, a liberal magazine of opinion that would become one of the most influential political journals in America. As an editor and writer for the magazine, he had a platform to develop and disseminate his ideas. His editorials and essays reached policymakers, intellectuals, and educated readers across the country. The New Republic became a crucial venue for progressive thought during the Wilson era. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, Lippmann initially supported American neutrality. However, as the war progressed and German actions became more aggressive, he shifted toward supporting American intervention. By 1917, when the United States entered the war, Lippmann was working closely with the Wilson administration. He was appointed to a position in the War Department where he helped shape American propaganda efforts. Lippmann served as secretary of a group called the Inquiry, which was tasked with gathering information and developing recommendations for the peace settlement that would follow the war. This work brought him into direct contact with President Woodrow Wilson and other top officials. Lippmann contributed to the development of Wilson's 14 points, the statement of war aims that would guide American policy at the Paris Peace Conference. Lippmann attended the Paris Peace Conference in 1919 as part of the American delegation. He witnessed firsthand the political maneuvering and compromises that shaped the Treaty of Versailles. The experience was disillusioning. Lippmann had hoped that the peace settlement would create a new international order based on rational principles and national self-determination. Instead, he saw the victorious powers pursuing their own interests and imposing a punitive peace on Germany. The gap between Wilson's idealistic rhetoric and the harsh realities of the treaty troubled him deeply. After the war, Lippmann returned to journalism with a more skeptical view of democracy and public opinion. In 1922, he published Public Opinion, perhaps his most important and influential book. The work was a systematic analysis of how people form opinions about politics and society. Lippmann argued that most citizens do not and cannot have direct knowledge of the complex issues facing modern societies. Instead, they rely on simplified mental images or stereotypes. The news media creates these images, and they shape public opinion more than facts or rational analysis. Lippmann introduced the concept of the pseudo-environment, the mental representations of reality that people use to navigate political life. He argued that democracy as traditionally understood was impossible in modern mass societies because citizens could not be adequately informed about the issues they were supposed to decide. The book was controversial and remains debated to this day. In 1925, Lippmann published a follow-up work called The Phantom Public, which further developed his critique of democratic theory. He argued that the public was not capable of directing public affairs in any meaningful way. Instead, he proposed that democracy should be understood more modestly, as a system in which citizens occasionally intervene to support or oppose those in power but do not actually govern. These ideas placed Lippmann at odds with more optimistic democratic theorists, but they reflected his honest assessment based on observation and analysis. Throughout the 1920s, Lippmann continued to write for the New Republic and other publications. He became one of the most respected political commentators in America. His writing was characterized by clarity, sophistication, and a willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. He was neither a conventional liberal nor a conservative but rather an independent thinker who evaluated each issue on its merits. In 1929, Lippmann left the New Republic to join the New York World, one of the leading newspapers of the era. He wrote editorials for the paper and established himself as a major voice in American journalism. However, the World ceased publication in 1931, a victim of the economic pressures of the Great Depression. After the World closed, Lippmann joined the New York Herald Tribune and began writing a column called Today and Tomorrow. The column would run for the next 36 years and would make Lippmann perhaps the most influential journalist in America. His columns were syndicated in hundreds of newspapers across the country and around the world. Presidents, senators, diplomats, and intellectuals read his work. His analysis and opinion shaped political debate and influenced policy decisions. The column gave Lippmann a platform unlike any journalist before him had possessed. In the early years of the Great Depression, Lippmann was skeptical of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. He worried that Roosevelt's programs represented dangerous expansions of government power and departures from sound economic principles. Lippmann had supported Roosevelt's opponent in the 1932 election, and he remained critical of many New Deal initiatives throughout the 1930s. However, his criticism was thoughtful and substantive rather than merely partisan. He engaged seriously with the economic and political challenges of the Depression while questioning whether the New Deal solutions were appropriate. As the 1930s progressed and the threat of fascism grew in Europe, Lippmann's attention increasingly turned to foreign affairs. He watched with alarm as Hitler consolidated power in Germany and as Japan pursued aggressive expansion in Asia. Lippmann argued that the United States needed to recognize the growing threats to international order and prepare to defend American interests. However, he was cautious about military intervention, believing that American policy should be guided by careful calculation of national interests rather than idealistic crusades. When World War II began in Europe in 1939, Lippmann supported aid to Britain and France while stopping short of advocating immediate American entry into the war. He believed that a German victory would threaten American security and that the United States had a vital interest in preventing Nazi domination of Europe. After France fell in 1940, Lippmann became more vocal in arguing that America needed to prepare for war. He supported Roosevelt's efforts to aid Britain and to build up American military forces. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Lippmann supported the American war effort completely. During World War II, Lippmann's columns provided analysis and commentary on military strategy, diplomacy, and war aims. He had access to top officials and was privy to information not available to most journalists. His writing helped shape public understanding of the war and influenced debates about American strategy. However, Lippmann also made mistakes during this period. Most notably, he supported the internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, arguing that military necessity justified the mass removal and detention of American citizens of Japanese descent. This position, which he later regretted, reflected the wartime hysteria and prejudice of the era. It remains a stain on his record and a reminder that even the most sophisticated intellectuals can succumb to fear and prejudice. As the war drew to a close, Lippmann turned his attention to the shape of the post-war world. He advocated for American engagement in international affairs and supported the creation of the United Nations. However, he was realistic about the limitations of international organizations and the persistence of power politics among nations. He believed that peace would depend on cooperation among the major powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1943, Lippmann published U.S. Foreign Policy, Shield of the Republic, in which he argued for a foreign policy based on a realistic assessment of American interests and capabilities rather than on idealistic principles. The book was influential in shaping post-war American strategic thinking. After the war ended in 1945, relations between the United States and the Soviet Union quickly deteriorated. The wartime alliance gave way to the Cold War, a global struggle between capitalism and communism, democracy and totalitarianism. Lippmann initially hoped that accommodation between the two superpowers was possible. He met with Soviet officials and sought to understand their perspective. However, as Soviet actions in Eastern Europe became more aggressive and as the Iron Curtain descended across the continent, Lippmann recognized that a fundamental conflict existed between American and Soviet interests. In 1947, Lippmann published a series of columns critiquing the emerging American strategy of containment, which had been articulated by diplomat George Kennan in an anonymous article in Foreign Affairs. Lippmann argued that the containment strategy was too broad, too ambitious, and too militaristic. He believed it would commit the United States to defending every point on the globe against communist expansion, a task that was beyond American capabilities and that would exhaust American resources. These columns were collected in a book called The Cold War, which gave the conflict its enduring name. Lippmann's critique of containment was prescient in many ways, anticipating problems that would plague American foreign policy for decades. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Lippmann continued to write his column and to comment on the major issues of the day. He criticized McCarthyism and the anti-communist hysteria that gripped America in the early 1950s. He warned against the dangers of ideological thinking in foreign policy. He advocated for negotiation and diplomacy rather than military confrontation with the Soviet Union. His positions often put him at odds with the prevailing consensus in Washington, but his reputation and the quality of his analysis ensured that his voice was heard. In 1958, Lippmann left the Herald Tribune and moved his column to the Washington Post. The move reflected both personal conflicts at the Herald Tribune and Lippmann's desire for a platform more sympathetic to his views. At the Post, he continued to write Today and Tomorrow and to shape political debate. He also began appearing on television, bringing his analysis to a broader audience. His interviews with world leaders and his commentary on current events made him a familiar figure to millions of Americans who had never read his columns. During the 1960s, Lippmann became increasingly critical of American foreign policy, particularly the growing involvement in Vietnam. He argued that Vietnam was not vital to American security and that the war was a mistake that would drain American resources and credibility. He met with President Johnson and urged him to seek a negotiated settlement. However, Johnson ignored his advice and escalated American involvement. Lippmann's opposition to the Vietnam War was based on the same realistic assessment of American interests that had guided his thinking throughout his career. He believed that the United States was overextending itself in pursuit of objectives that were not achievable and not worth the cost. Lippmann's criticism of the Vietnam War put him at odds with the Johnson administration and with many in the foreign policy establishment. However, his opposition proved prescient as the war dragged on and American casualties mounted without bringing victory any closer. His willingness to challenge the consensus and to speak truth to power, even at the cost of his access and influence, demonstrated his integrity and independence. In 1967, at the age of 77, Lippmann wrote his last Today and Tomorrow column. He had been writing the column for 36 years, producing thousands of columns that had shaped American political discourse and influenced policy decisions. His retirement marked the end of an era in American journalism. After retiring from his column, Lippmann remained active as a writer and commentator. He published occasional essays and gave interviews. He continued to follow political events and to offer his perspective on the issues of the day. However, his influence gradually waned as a new generation of journalists and commentators emerged and as the political landscape shifted. Throughout his post-retirement years, Lippmann remained engaged with the intellectual and political currents of his time. He corresponded with scholars, politicians, and journalists. He reflected on his long career and on the changes he had witnessed in American society and politics. He had lived through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and the social upheavals of the 1960s. He had known presidents from Theodore Roosevelt to Richard Nixon. He had witnessed the transformation of America from a provincial power to a global superpower. Lippmann married Faye Albertson in 1938, his second marriage after divorcing his first wife. Faye was a supportive partner who shared his intellectual interests and who helped manage his public life. They remained together until his death. His personal life was marked by the same complexity and contradiction that characterized his public career. On December 14, 1974, Walter Lippmann died at his home in New York City. He was 85 years old. His death marked the end of a remarkable life that had spanned nearly the entire 20th century. Lippmann's funeral was attended by hundreds, including political leaders, journalists, and intellectuals who had been influenced by his work. He was buried in a private ceremony, in keeping with his reserved personal style. Lippmann's legacy is vast and multifaceted. He was one of the most important journalists of the 20th century, a man whose columns shaped political debate for nearly 4 decades. He was also a serious political philosopher whose books on democracy and public opinion remain influential and widely studied. His critique of democratic theory challenged fundamental assumptions about citizen competence and political participation. His analysis of foreign policy provided a framework for thinking about American interests and strategy that influenced generations of policymakers and scholars. Modern historians and political scientists continue to debate Lippmann's ideas and legacy. Some criticize his elitism and his skepticism about democracy. They argue that his pessimism about citizen capabilities became a self-fulfilling prophecy, justifying rule by experts and undermining efforts at democratic participation. Others defend his realism and his willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of democracy in mass societies. They note that his analysis of public opinion and media influence was prescient and remains relevant in an age of social media and political polarization. Lippmann's foreign policy thinking has also been reassessed by scholars. His critique of containment and his warnings about overextension in Vietnam have been vindicated by history. His advocacy for a foreign policy based on realistic assessment of interests rather than ideological crusades offers lessons for contemporary debates about American strategy. Yet his support for Japanese internment during World War II remains an indelible mark against his record, a reminder that even the most brilliant minds can be swept up in the prejudices and fears of their time. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Walter Lippmann comes from recognizing both his extraordinary contributions and his limitations. He was a man of immense intellectual gifts who used his talents to illuminate the political and social issues of his time. He was honest in his analysis, even when it challenged prevailing orthodoxies or his own earlier positions. He was willing to change his mind when evidence and experience warranted. Yet he was also a product of his class and generation, with blind spots and prejudices that limited his vision. Lippmann represents a particular type of public intellectual, the journalist-philosopher who bridges the worlds of ideas and action. He was not an academic isolated in a university, nor was he merely a reporter chronicling events. Instead, he occupied a unique position, using journalism as a vehicle for serious political and social analysis while engaging directly with the policymakers and issues of his time. This role, which Lippmann exemplified better than perhaps anyone else in American history, has become increasingly rare in an age of specialization and media fragmentation. In the end, Walter Lippmann was neither a perfect sage nor a flawed prophet, but rather a brilliant observer and analyst who grappled honestly with the most important questions of his era. His legacy includes both enduring insights about democracy, public opinion, and foreign policy, as well as errors of judgment that reflected the limitations of his perspective. He is remembered today primarily for his journalism and his books on democratic theory, which is fitting for a man who devoted his life to understanding and explaining politics to his fellow citizens. Lippmann was even in death a man of influence and contradiction, remembered for his intellectual contributions and his journalistic excellence rather than for any single policy achievement or political position.